Hello and welcome to New Frame Plus, a series about video game animation. I always find it fascinating to look back over a franchise's history and see how the animation of each game builds upon the last. And the Pokémon series is an especially interesting case because it has a scope problem built right into its core concept. Ever since that first pair of games, the artists and designers at Game Freak have had to find an answer to the question, how are we going to present animated battles with this many dang Pokémon? So today, I thought it might be fun to do a little animation retrospective. Let's look at the portrayal of trainer battles in the last 7 generations of Pokémon games to find out how has Pokémon's battle animation evolved over time. Now, I'm going to try to keep this retrospective focused on just the core series of Pokémon titles, else we'd be here all day. And also, before we start, I want to give a big thank you to a particular YouTube channel without which this episode would not be possible, Nintendo Unity. See, I usually prefer to capture all the game footage for these episodes myself, but Nintendo handhelds make that very, very difficult. Fortunately for me, the folks at Nintendo Unity have recorded and uploaded hours of high-quality footage from every generation of Pokémon. You should check them out. I'm going to put a link to their channel in the top right corner. No joke, might not have been able to do this episode without their videos, so huge thank you to them. Anyway, we have got a lot of Pokémon games to talk about. Let's get going. Up first, we've got Gen 1, the original 1998 Game Boy Classics, Pokémon Red and Blue. And even here, at the very start of the franchise, Game Freak is already looking at a pretty challenging problem. This game has 151 collectible creatures, each of which can learn a wide variety of combat moves. And this is a game about battling those collectible Pokémon, so Game Freak needs a way of presenting JRPG-style battles between any combination of these creatures and their wide variety of moves, and making that look exciting. And they have to do all that on a Game Boy, with all of the technical limitations inherent to 8-bit portable hardware. So how did Game Freak ultimately go about animating these battles? Their solution, and I think it's a clever one, was to animate not every Pokémon, but every attack. Each Pokémon is represented in battle by one of 2 static images, either a front-facing or a back-facing sprite. But every attack in the game has its own custom batch of animations attached. They may have animated sprite effects, they might make the Pokémon flicker or shake or bounce around in unique ways, they might even shake the entire screen. And the clever thing about this approach is that because none of these attack animations require different sprite art for the Pokémon, literally any Pokémon in the game could hypothetically use any one of these moves. I mean, they can't because of the game's rules, but visually they could. That is a very efficient solution to the problem, and it's a solution that Game Freak would continue to use for a very long time. With the next game in the series, Pokémon Yellow, and even going into Gen 2 with Pokémon Gold and Silver, the only changes worth noting are updates to each Pokémon's sprite art. The approach to battle animation goes almost completely unchanged. The first truly significant addition wouldn't come until the tail end of Gen 2 with Pokémon Crystal. This enhanced update to Gold and Silver has the unique distinction of being the first core Pokémon title in which all of the Pokémon were given their own bespoke animation. In Pokémon Crystal, when your opponent summons a Pokémon to the field, they pop out of their ball and a little summon animation plays. Now, this animation only exists for forward-facing sprites, so you'll only ever see it on your opponent's Pokémon during battle. And the animations themselves are very simple, but even so, some of these have up to 7 unique frames of pixel art, up from the 1 front-facing sprite all the previous games had. And considering the fact that they had to do this for 251 creatures, that's an impressive early investment in the animation of these Pokémon. Now, this was clearly an experiment, and one that was immediately abandoned for the next game. I'm guessing that Game Freak ultimately concluded that this approach just would not scale as future games added more and more Pokémon to the count. And yeah, I kinda have to agree. I mean, if you're gonna go to the trouble to create between 2 and 6 additional frames of animation for every single Pokémon, it does seem like kind of a waste to spend all of those frames on the first few seconds a Pokémon hits the field. Like, there had to be a more efficient way to go about that. This brings us to Gen 3, Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. The franchise has now leapt to Nintendo's shiny new Game Boy Advance, but the series' approach to battle animations is only seeing small, incremental additions. Every Pokémon gets another round of updated sprite art. Now the Pokémon are popping out of actual Pokéballs, and you actually get to see your trainer throw yours. That's cool. When the summoned Pokemon appear, the scaling effect on their sprites looking a lot smoother. The animation of attack effects is starting to look a lot more impressive. The Pokemon sprites can be rotated now, that used to be impossible. And now, both your Pokemon and their status bar bob up and down a bit when it's your turn, which not only make your Pokemon look a little more lively, which, I mean, finally, but also clearly communicates to the player that it's their turn to pick a move. And both teams now have this little platform shape to stand on, which helps them to feel more grounded and creates a sense of space. The Pokemon aren't just hovering in an empty void anymore. Now there's at least the suggestion of a little battlefield. Now that is legitimately a lot of great presentational changes, and all these incremental adjustments combined result in what feels like a pretty substantial upgrade. But underneath it all, the fundamental approach to animating Pokemon trainer battles is still basically the same. Nearly all animation is driven by the attacks, and all participants are otherwise just static images. And this pattern wouldn't see another substantial change until the very tail end of Gen 3 a few games later with Pokémon Emerald. Crystal might have been the first game to give each Pokemon an animation to call their own, but Emerald would be the game to find an efficient way to implement that idea. Rather than giving every Pokemon 3 to 6 additional frames of pixel art to animate just a single moment, which is not super practical, Game Freak instead created custom summon animations for every Pokemon by giving them each just one additional front-facing pose and plussing that with some movement and rotation on the sprite, which is not only a way more efficient use of resources than Crystal's approach, but honestly I think it looks better too. And because translation and rotation are key components of these new summoning animations, even though the back-facing Pokemon don't get a new sprite to work with, they do still get some animation of their own when they come on the field. These are looking really nice. And I think it's interesting that so far, both of the times Game Freak has chosen to give each Pokemon more sprites to work with, additional frames of animation, both times they've chosen to spend that frame on your opponent's Pokemon being summoned. That's an interesting choice, because when you think about it, they could have made a custom sprite for all kinds of things. For example, you could add an attack pose, like a more aggressive pose the Pokemon could strike when it's their turn to move. Alternatively, you could add a hit react for when the Pokemon takes damage, which would lend way more impact to whatever attack was just delivered. Or you could add a weakened state, some new pose to show that a Pokemon's really on the ropes, like maybe they switch to this pose when their health bar drops into the red. Any one of these could be used to make battles more visually exciting and provide the player more visual feedback, but one potential problem with all of those alternatives is that they could easily have the unintended side effect of making Pokemon battles feel a little more violent. You see, Nintendo and Game Freak have spent decades now desperately trying to spin the idea of Pokemon battling as chill and all in good fun and something that Pokemon enjoy, and definitely not dogfighting. No, see, it's just fainting because of all the fun it's having. So if the one pose we add to this mix is one which emphasizes aggression, or even worse, being hurt, that really harshes the whole vibe this franchise is desperately trying to maintain. What they did instead, and I think this is a pretty good call, was effectively create an emote pose, an animation that lets each Pokemon express more of their unique personality when they appear. And I like that a lot. Honestly, I wonder if they could have gotten even more use out of this new sprite. Kinda seems like a waste to only see that animation when a Pokemon enters the field, but whatever, it's just nice having some animation on these things again. And this time, that summon animation would stick. Which brings us to Gen 4. The Nintendo DS era is here. Lots of big changes coming, just not quite yet. Hang in there. Starting with Diamond and Pearl, Game Freak would take advantage of this hardware upgrade to do some more extensive manipulation of the sprites they had, adding some squash and stretch to most of their animations and just making everything feel a bit more malleable and organic. Even the Pokeball does a great little squash and stretch when it opens. I love it. Pokémon Platinum would put some animation on the enemy trainers and add a new frame to the back-facing sprite's summon animation, finally giving your own team of Pokémon a new sprite to call their own. And you know, they've earned it because they work hard. And Pokémon HeartGold and SoulSilver wouldn't change much of anything. To be fair, they did make some big additions elsewhere, like allowing every Pokémon in the game to follow your trainer around the world map, which is wonderful and like one of the best new features they ever added and probably required a ton of new sprite work, but it's not a battle animation change, is it? Go on, shoo. At this point, we're 10 games deep into the Pokémon franchise, and as you've probably noticed, at least in terms of animating trainer battles, the series has very much settled into a consistent rhythm. Give each new game a fresh batch of sprite art, make the attack animations look a little cooler, see if there's some small improvement to be made that's not going to radically increase the series' development scope, and boom, ship it. And I'm not meaning that to sound critical either, that's a really sensible approach. Game Freak had found a workable solution to a legitimate scope problem, and one which not only gave them some room to iterate, but also allowed them to keep adding new Pokémon without biting off more than they could chew. But after more than 12 years of subtle upgrades and improvements, opportunities for iteration on the old approach were starting to run scarce, and fan expectations for future games weren't gonna just stop climbing. The series was overdue for a big step forward, and by gosh we got one with Pokémon Black and White. Gen 5 brought a huge visual upgrade to Pokémon battles, which is pretty amazing considering we are still on the Nintendo DS here. Like, none of these changes come from an increase in hardware power, just a massive expansion in production scope. Watch closely as your trainer winds up to throw that Pokéball onto the field. It looks nice, right? Several custom frames of animation dedicated just to throwing the— hang on, wait! That sprite's arm moved. It actually rotated at the shoulder. That's not how pixel sprites work. Yes, indeed, Gen 5 introduces to 2D Pokémon skeletal deformation. Instead of just moving the entire sprite or creating new static poses to act as additional animation frames, this movement is achieved by breaking the character sprite into separate parts, in this case the torso and the arm, and using a skeleton of invisible joints to rotate or deform those parts individually. It's basically turning the sprite into a simple puppet, a lot like you would in 3D animation. You've probably seen this same approach used in 2D animated TV shows before, except here they're applying that technique to pixel art, which gives a very neat look. And when you apply that same technique to the Pokémon themselves, the results look fantastic. Look at them! Look at these Pokémon! They're flapping wings, they're bobbing in place, their whatevers are swishing in the breeze. This one's swinging around like a chandelier and flexing its limbs? Whatever. For the first time in the core series, these Pokémon are actually looking alive. This is a big moment in Pokémon history, and it represents a huge commitment on Game Freak's part. Remember, we are 5 generations in now. There are, as of Pokémon Black and White, 649 Pokémon in existence, and all of those Pokémon have to be animated now. Granted, it's not a ton of animation per Pokémon. They all basically just have front and back-facing versions of an idle loop with a more expressive little fidget thrown in here and there. The animation of individual attacks are still carrying a lot of the weight with their effects and shudders and flickers and flashes, but still, just adding this handful of animations for 649 Pokémon is a lot. And the thing is, once the world saw this, there's no way the series could ever go back to static sprites again. The new bar for Pokémon battle animation had been set. Now, I can envision an alternate history where the Pokémon franchise maintained and iterated on this particular style of 2D pixel animation for at least another generation of games, and I kind of would have loved to see what came of that. But the eventual transition to 3D graphics was inevitable, and the arrival of Nintendo's shiny new 3DS was as good an occasion for that change as any. Thus, we arrive at Gen 6, Pokémon X and Y. The leap to eye-popping 3D has finally happened, which necessitates some scary changes, but also comes with some potentially huge presentational and production advantages. With the old 2D sprites, just showing a Pokémon from a different angle required creating a completely new piece of pixel art. But now we can just move the camera, which means that where once we might have needed 2 versions of every animation, a back-facing one and a front-facing one, now just one animation should be able to handle the job from any angle you like. And because we're in a true 3D environment with a proper camera that can navigate that 3D space, Game Freak can show any given action from whatever angle they think is most exciting. They can emulate handheld movements, they can even go split screen. Heck, Mega Evolutions kick off a full-blown transformation sequence. What's more, because certain Pokémon have similar proportions, as digital models, some of them may even be able to share rigs, which might allow for a small degree of animation sharing. And, even better, once those 3D animations are created, you can pretty easily make adjustments to each Pokémon's model, textures, and shading without having to change the animation those assets are attached to. More on that later. But even with those production benefits, taking this franchise into 3D is daunting. Until recently, these games have gotten by with little to no animation on the Pokémon in battle, but that's not gonna fly anymore. With a pixel art sprite, we're generally okay letting our imagination fill in the gaps, but a static 3D model just tends to look lifeless. Basically, if you put a 3D Pokémon in front of us, we are going to expect to see that Pokémon move like an actual living creature. So, as of Pokémon X and Y, Game Freak has animated every single darn one of those Pokémon. Summon animations, idle loops, idle fidgets, attacks, hit reacts, feints. Every single Pokémon that might appear in the game needs a full animation set, which means that Game Freak has to make a full suite of animations for about 720 Pokémon. Now, let's conservatively estimate that each one of these Pokémon needs, 6 animations to cover everything that they might need to do in battle. That means that for just the Pokémon, and just for battles, that's 4,320 new animations needed. Yikes, that's a scary number. And the real animation count per Pokémon is almost definitely more than 6, so let's just add one more, let's say it's 7. That takes us up to 5,040 animations. And if we add just one more to the list, it's 5,760. With this many Pokémon in the roster, every single animation addition is going to have enormous production consequences. And if you start factoring into that math all the other animations they'd have to make outside the battle screen, like human character animations and, Pokémon-Ami, wow, it kinda starts making you dizzy. Now, it is true that this is technically not the first time Pokémon's made the jump to 3D. I mean, there were the Stadium games, there was Colosseum, XD, Battle Revolution. All of those already featured 3D animated Pokémon battles. But all of those games had the benefit of reduced scope. Fewer total Pokémon to animate, only having to worry about battle animations. And although those games did sometimes do a better job at showing Pokémon performing distinct moves, the animation quality was a little inconsistent. Perfectly serviceable for its time, just not necessarily something that Game Freak could just drop into X and Y and call finished. Even if they wanted to, I'm guessing that X and Y's 3D Pokémon aren't using the same rigs those spin-off games used, and transferring an animation between two different rigs can be a real headache. But anyway, however they chose to go about it, it is so much work. Game Freak apparently had to staff up pretty significantly for Pokémon X and Y, with the core dev team consisting of 200 people, which is a pretty large team for a handheld game. The Pokémon series is a cascading scope explosion at this point, which, come to think of it, sounds like a very cool Pokémon move. But knowing that, it kind of starts to make sense that they keep on producing remakes of older generations using the latest gen's tech, right? Like Fire Red and Leaf Green, HeartGold and SoulSilver. I mean, if you've just spent a ton developing new art and animation assets for the entire Pokémon roster, you might as well get some more use out of that updated library before moving on. And reuse that library they would. If you look ahead to Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Sun and Moon, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and even Pokemon Go and Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, each of these games would bring a new round of minor adjustments to the fidelity and shading style on the Pokemon's digital models, but if you look at their animations, you might notice that a lot of them are looking pretty familiar, and that is because they are largely unchanged. I mean, Game Freak had just invested a ton in converting the whole Pokédex to 3D, and they sure were not about to scrap that new library and rebuild it all over again just for kicks. And I am not gonna blame them for that, because redoing all of those animations for an ever-increasing count of Pokémon for every game, or even just every new generation, would be bonkers. I'm guessing one of the only reasons they justified that upfront development expense for X and Y was with the assumption that they'd be able to pull from that same animation library for a long time. And it's a smart strategy, especially considering the fact that we've got around 800 Pokémon in existence by this point. It would be easy to call this a repeat of that Gen 1 to Gen 4 streak, to say that we've basically been watching a second era of tiny iterations only in 3D this time. But I think that would kinda sell these recent generations short, because some of the iterative changes they've added have been great, and not small changes. As of Pokémon Sun and Moon, all of your trainer opponents get a pre-fight animation, which lets their individual personalities shine through. And even better, now the Pokémon trainers stay on the field with their Pokémon and are visibly present throughout the battle. They've got their own idols and command animations and everything. I love that addition. And Pokémon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee applied all of the new presentation style to the old games, but threw a few retro twists in there for fun. Like, you remember how the battles used to start with a still image of the trainers sliding on screen? Now the 3D models slide in the exact same way before they start animating for the fight proper, and I love that. Which, I guess, brings us to the newly announced Generation 8, Pokémon Sword and Shield. We don't have a whole lot of concrete details yet, but I'm going to speculate anyway because none of you are here to stop me. My guess is that we can look to Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee for some clues, as that game seems like it was probably at least a partial trial run for Gen 8's features and presentation. And given that, I would say that it's a pretty safe bet that they are going to continue using battle animations from that same library we've been seeing, or at least using it as a foundation to build upon. And I can understand why that might be a little frustrating to some. But the great part about them continuing to use this strategy is that it frees up resources for when they want to try adding a new animation to the list. It's probably clear by now that an inherent flaw with my approach going into this episode is that viewing the franchise's animation history strictly through the lens of battle animation ignores all of the other features that a game's animation budget could go to. Just as an example, if you look back at Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, in terms of scope, those games had the unique benefit of a significantly scaled down Pokédex, right? They went back to where things started with the original 151. That much smaller number makes the prospect of adding a new animation or two way less intimidating. And what did they do with that new flexibility? Among other things, they added follower Pokémon. And follower Pokémon are amazing. They let you express yourself by choosing which Pokémon you want to accompany you around the world map, and they let the Pokémon express themselves by showing how they walk, or roll, or fly, or waddle, and that's great. These are the sorts of additions that are way harder to justify if you're rebuilding the entire animation library from scratch for every game. Maybe for Gen 8, follower Pokémon will finally be a thing for all who knows how many hundred Pokémon in the Pokédex. We haven't seen that since HeartGold and SoulSilver. Or maybe they'll put those animation resources towards some entirely new cool feature. But let's just say, hypothetically, that they did decide to give the battle animations another overhaul. What sort of changes would we want to see? Now, if you asked a younger me, my dream pitch would probably be to see the Pokémon actually moving around the battlefield, or performing more specific attack animations for every type of move, or actually making contact with their opponent at some point. And while today me recognizes that properly executing on some of those dream changes would likely balloon the game's animation budget into the stratosphere and risk making the game start to look more like that fantasy dogfighting genre that the series is just trying so hard to pretend not to be, I certainly wouldn't be mad if they tried it. But now I actually don't think all that is necessary. If I could make a change to the way Pokémon animation looks now, and one that probably wouldn't break the bank, at least not quite as badly, I think I'd want to see the animations we already have just be made more appealing. Because that huge library of 3D animations Game Freak has been accumulating since X and Y, they look fine? They're fine. They do get the job done, and there's a consistent level of polish across the whole Pokédex, which is great. I am impressed as heck by the sheer scope of what they've done here, but just looking at each Pokémon individually, I do find a lot of the animation on them to be somewhat bland. And it's not just that they're standing in one place, it's that there's just not a lot of animation contrast between them. They all have this similar level of energy, a similar speed to their movement, a similar rhythm to their cycles, just a generally samey quality to their motion. In a weird way, they sort of strike me as living 3D incarnations of those old static sprites. Like, the design is doing all of the appeal work here, and the animation is doing just enough to make that design look alive. And maybe that was somewhat intentional. I mean, so much of this 3D presentation approach is adhering to the nostalgic feel of classic Pokémon battles. two creatures standing in place, exchanging attacks that are mostly sold through impressive effects. I don't know if that's an aesthetic choice or just careful scope management, which I could understand, but I feel like keeping the Pokemon's individual animations so homogeneous and minimalist really hinders their ability to bring out each creature's full appeal potential. Like, imagine if even a fraction of the Pokemon roster had half as much animation appeal as Pikachu. Pikachu has benefited from 2 decades of focused iteration, and they have polished that character's appeal to a mirror shine at this point. And I just know that a large portion of the rest of the Pokédex has that same personality potential. I mean, look at these designs, they are amazing. This game is jam-packed with delightful creatures, and also Pichu. Imagine if they expressed more of that in their animation. Heck, look at how many more people fell in love with Eevee the instant they gave that Pokemon some more love and care. Now, I'll grant you that putting that sort of concentrated focus into every one of these hundreds of Pokemon probably isn't feasible, and maybe it just isn't possible to achieve Pikachu or Eevee levels of appeal without all of the additional animations and screen time those Pokemon get. Or maybe the homogeneity of all these Pokemon's animation is just a result of the animators having to crank out like 10 finished animations per day. I don't know. I didn't say this was an easy problem to solve. All I'm saying is that I'm willing to bet that if you infuse these existing battle animations with just a little more interesting contrast, a little more of the personality that each of these Pokemon's designs already hint at, the appeal of the roster as a whole would go up considerably. From a distance, it's easy to look at the animation in Pokémon and see a series that rarely changes anything, to see a franchise coasting on old assets and aging designs. And I guess that's not entirely untrue, but I think that assessment really undersells Game Freak's achievements. If this retrospective has shown us anything, it's that Pokémon is a series made of slow, iterative improvements and very carefully managed scope. Avoiding scope creep is a difficult discipline for any game studio, and the fact that this studio keeps finding small ways to make each game look a little better, no matter how many Pokémon they've got to apply those updates to, is really amazing. Whatever Game Freak ultimately chooses to do with Sword and Shield, I am excited to see it. If you are somehow not tired of hearing about Pokémon and would like to learn a little bit more about Pokémon creature design, JoCat actually made a video about that subject recently. I will link to it in the top right corner now. It's a really interesting look at the art design approach to creating one of these cute little things. But yeah, I hope you have enjoyed this extended field trip through the history of Pokémon's battle animations. And of course, another big thank you to Nintendo Unity for just existing and recording so much beautiful Pokémon footage. This video would have looked like garbage without it. So go visit their channel and give them some likes from me, will ya? If you want to see more videos about game animation, be sure to subscribe to New Frame Plus and consider supporting the channel like all of these wonderful patrons here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.